Live via Zoom from the Emerald City and the city that never sleeps, it's the first annual Jews on Film Oyscars. And now, your hosts, Harry Ottensosa and Daniel Zana.
Thank you. And welcome everyone to a very special episode of Jews on Film. My name is Harry Ottensosa. I'm your Jewish film podcaster.
And I'm your co-host, Daniel Zana. And today we are very, very excited to present the first annual Jews on Film Oyscars, aka our 2024 year-end special / 2025 beginning year in review. And let's get started. Harry, where do you want to start?
For our audience, first time we're doing this, but we really just wanted to celebrate what I think was a pretty Jewish year in movies, both on the Oscar stage, and I want to have a brief discussion about some of the movies nominated this year, some of the very Jewish movies, I would argue, that are nominated this year, and then hopefully we'll save some time to really dive into a reflection on our year, the 2024 season of Jews on Film, and talk about some of our favorite Jewish moments from the year. But let's start up top with the Oscars, and I want to talk about it. I know, Daniel, I know, between the two of us, I think maybe between the two of us, we've seen 10 movies that are nominated. I know neither of us have seen all of them, but what do you think of that statement that I just made, that this was a pretty Jewish movie year, especially for the Oscar-nominated Best Picture movies?
Leading up to a lot of these movies getting released, I was just, very excited and kind of frankly shocked that so many films were sort of explicitly Jewish movies. I'm talking about films like The Brutalist, A Complete Unknown to a lesser extent, but films like A Real Pain and, Between the Temples. I think just seeing that stuff out in the wild, in theaters is really remarkable to see. There's other films that are a little bit less explicitly Jewish that we can definitely tease out, but it's really nice to see, frankly.
I was a bit surprised just how explicitly it was. Like, listeners of our podcast will obviously know our takes on A Real Pain. That was one that, unfortunately, as I think I correctly predicted in that episode, missed out on a Best Picture nominee, but hopefully we'll still go home with Oyscar glory and Oscar glory through the supporting performance of Kieran Culkin. But it was shocking to see just so many movies that were so explicit in their text. So you mentioned A Real Pain, you mentioned The Brutalist, which of course, for those who haven't seen it, is about a Jewish Holocaust survivor, a brutalist architect from his home country who comes to America and kind of finds his identity again. And, hopefully we'll save that for a full-length discussion when we actually cover that on the podcast. I think we have some, machinations in the work to get an episode on that. But it was really cool to see so many Jewish characters and so many Jewish scenes. And of course, you also teased, stretches. And I said this to you right before we started recording, but I wasn't sure if every movie this year just coincidentally happened to be super Jewish, or if maybe a little bit of it was my Jewish glasses have kind of stayed on my face after a year and a few years now of doing this podcast and watching things for Jewishness. But I want to run through a couple of the movies that were nominated and just see, there actually is some subtextual Jewishness. So, one that I've seen actually a couple people say, and, the bar for how Jewish was this really and am I crazy is if you Google the name of movie and then Jewish, do you get some articles? Do you get those?
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Daniel, you could throw out, I know there's some of the classic websites that we've even used for some tips in the past to explore some themes that just throw out 10 Jewish things about this movie that you didn't realize. But, starting at the bottom of our list here, the movie Wicked, for one, very Jewish. And this is one that, again, I think goes beyond my stretch. I know a lot of this goes back to Stephen Schwartz, who is the composer of all the music, but he's someone who's very explicitly talked about the Jewishness that he saw in the character of Elphaba. And obviously, she's a character, this oppressed minority character that I know has been connected to through multiple different ways. There are a lot of people who see themselves in her performance in Cynthia Erivo's performance in that role in the movie. But it's cool to see the creator, of the theatrical version of the character just talk about infusing his Jewishness into it. There's tons of subplots in the movie for those who have seen it of, this kind of the animal people in that world being oppressed and kind of removed from their positions, their scholarly positions of authority. And it's been, again, very explicitly stated that it was evocative of, Holocaust imagery and of similar things obviously happening in 1930s Germany. So again, I just wanted to throw that out there. Very Jewish movie. Wicked, nominated for Best Picture. Pretty cool.
Yeah, not a lot to say for me about Conclave, but I do know that there's a lot of kippas in that movie. So shout out to all the kippas depicted in Conclave. I don't know. Harry, did you see that one?
I did see Conclave. That's a really good call because Conclave, it's another one that I'm happy you mentioned because, even just a religious movie at the forefront, that wouldn't be the first time that we've discussed on this podcast movies that, aren't necessarily discussing Jewishness, but we found parallels in another religion. And I don't know, that movie obviously depicts the election of a new pope, and I'm not sure, I don't think that's a practice that we necessarily have, in the Jewish world. I'm not sure. Maybe, you could talk about any, rabbi search committee and maybe find a lot of parallels in the dynamics at play there. But between the kippah and I think the kippahs that I think you're absolutely correct to point out, I was watching the movie and similarly thinking, oh, why are they all in their yarmulkes? Right. That's, not only us. But even just like some of the tensions in that movie, for those who've seen it, between the future of this religion, right? Part of the choice for who's going to be the next pope stems on, falls down on questions of, how far should this religion go towards welcoming people versus holding on to its identity, modernity versus tradition. Like, these are questions that I certainly, see in my own life. And I agree with you. It was fascinating to see that on screen. And at Conclave, the most Catholic movie that could exist, let's add it to the Jewish canon. What do you think, Daniel?
I think that one's in, sure. Let's talk about the Chalamet effect. I think, Dune Part 2 and both a Complete Unknown were Timothée Chalamet vehicles. One obviously is the biopic of Bob Dylan, and the other one, Dune, is a sequel to the Frank Herbert, based movie that came out, the novel by Frank Herbert, but then this is the sequel. Does casting Timothée Chalamet in a movie automatically make it onto our list in some way, maybe an honorary mention?
Look, if we can claim Timothée Chalamet and all his performances as part of the clan, that would do such great things for, talk about good for the Jews,
Right.
Chalamet being connected to his Jewish identity. That's huge for us. And you mentioned Dune Part 2, like, for those who remember that movie, unfortunately it came out, almost a year ago, which is probably why it hasn't gotten much love in the Oscars, in the Oscar season this year, even though it was obviously nominated for Best Picture. But that's a movie that very explicitly is about, a messianic figure and the kind of allure of following him and the dangers of where that comes. To me, it's very evocative of the conversation we just had on the podcast with the movie Messiah of Evil, which I believe at the time that this episode's published, we won't have published that one yet. So this is just a teaser for those who want to check that out. But that was a movie where I think we had a very legitimate discussion about, religious kind of conviction and the communal effects that can have, but then the dangers of, where that can go the other way. And, Dune Part 2, I think, is doing that and then some. So Jewish.
Absolutely. I think, lots of references, I think, in Frank Herbert's original source material. I don't know. I read it like the B'nai Gesserit and the Lisan al-Gaib. So there's lots of like Arabic usage and some Hebrew in there. So I think, I think it's definitely on there, maybe to a lesser extent than maybe something like A Complete Unknown, which is like a Bob Dylan biopic. He was born Robert Zimmerman. He is, canonically and IRL a Jewish performer. So I think that one's on there. Just a quick shout out to Honora. I think was worth calling out. Mikey Madison. I believe I'm going to look up her birth name, Michaela Madison Rosberg. So she was born in.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So born, I believe, in the San Fernando Valley, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, she grew up in the Valley, and her parents are both psychologists, and she's Jewish. So whether or not she infused her performance in Nora with some Jewishness, I don't think so. But it's worth a shout out just in terms of. And I think I'll reserve the judgment of our thoughts on each of the films for maybe dedicated episodes as they are applicable. But I would say look out for future episodes on the Brutalist. I'm not sure there's others on this list that we'll be covering in the near future, but who knows?
Yeah, I was going to say, your mentioning of Honora kind of firmly took us into stretched territory with the Jewish funds. I think we made some cases. The audience can decide how convincing we were for some of the other films, but, just shout out to some of the other movies nominated, Amelia Perez, Nickel Boys. The Substance is one on there that, for those who've seen it, there's a lot of kind of bodily transformation. I could hear, Daniel, you talking about bar mitzvah, transformations and becoming an older version of yourself, a younger. There's a lot, going on there. So
I like that.
I think we might have it. Just keep to our audience, keep that in mind when you're watching. Let me know if that actually holds up in that ridiculous body horror, awesome movie. But I think, not much more to add there unless you want to chime in, Daniel. But you mentioned Between the Temples. movie that wasn't nominated for Best Picture. I saw it got a little bit of award season love this year, specifically for some of the lead performances. But, do you want to talk about that? Just, really Jewish movie sticking out in an otherwise pretty Jewish year?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was a really interesting film by Nathan Silver, starring Carol Kane and Jason Schwartzman and Robert Smigel. Just a terrific cast. Jason Schwartzman plays a cantor. Robert Smigel plays like the lead rabbi, and Carol Kane she's a convert who is getting her bat mitzvah, and just like a very, very Jewish film, very quirky, and kind of like a scrappy film, but very touching film in some ways, and very funny, kind of out in left field. And I really like that sort of the dedication to getting a lot of the things right that people often get wrong. So, yeah, wanted to shout that one out. And let's, while we have Hollywood listening, I would say let's just do more of that, more A Real Pain, more The Brutalist, more Between the Temples. Let's get it going this year, okay, in 2025. Yeah,
exactly. The fans of Jews on Film are excited to see more Jews on Film. And honestly, going through this discussion, I feel pretty good about this podcast continuing in the future, Daniel. We're not going to run out of material anytime soon. So that's a nice feeling.
Absolutely. And as we're looking forward in the future, it's always good to look back. So I think we should probably start our Oyscars ceremony, don't you think? And kind of like talk about, some of the things we've done over the past year in 2024. We did a number of episodes last year, and we've already kicked off a really strong first couple episodes this year. But
what we're going to do now is we're going to take us through, a couple different categories, hand out our first inaugural Oyscars, and, celebrate some of the movies we've watched, some of the most Jewish movies, some of the least expected, most Jewish movies, and, run through a couple categories. So, Daniel, I see on video you've got your Oyscar Award handy. So maybe to the filmmakers of these movies, if they're listening, feel free to contact us, jewsonfilmpod@gmail.com, to pick up your reward. Maybe we'll send you a mug as well if you win. But yeah, why don't you, Daniel, introduce the first question, and let's jump into giving out some of these awards.
Sure, absolutely. So I think for the category of
the favorite guest pick movie that you would have been least likely to watch on your own.
And the nominees are all of the films we did last year, which are too numerous to mention each time. But we have a list here, and you can check our feed for the past 18 or so episodes. But Harry, is there one that sticks out in your mind as something that was a movie that you would have not otherwise watched, that after the guest pick that you were like, oh, damn, this was great. Why didn't I know about this one?
I'm looking back at the list, and there's a couple of them. There's some great movies. Our guests always pick wonderful movies. If any of you are listening, yours was my favorite that was suggested. But, looking at some of the early ones we did, When Harry Met Sally, amazing, incredible Jewish movie. It might even show up in another category, but it was on the long list, I'll admit. I was planning on getting to that before some of the other ones I had seen. But I think I want to give a special shout out to Made for Each Other, the one that we did with Becky Feldman. Yes, thank you. Made for Each Other. Come collect your award. But that was the Hallmark Channel movie that was about the Golem character. And I'll admit, wasn't running to the Hallmark Channel. I wasn't planning on, checking out any of these movies, but I was, very surprised in a really fun way, not only how charming it was, but how authentically Jewish it felt. We definitely, for those who don't remember the episode, we definitely went back and forth on some of the pronunciations. There was the whole Rugula debate that I think we had at the time about, the right way to get through it. But that was a movie that seemed familiar with, the actual practices of the Golem, educated them to a new audience. I learned a little bit about it myself, and I enjoyed watching that one. So for my pick, I'm going to give it to Made for Each Other. And Daniel, why don't you present your pick for the movie that you most enjoyed, that you were least likely to have watched on your own, that was selected by a guest?
This is a tough race because I think there's a few that I have seen before, a few that I have not seen. Least likely. I think if you read the log line for any of the films, I think the one that I would have been like, yeah, this doesn't interest me, would probably be like Reversal of Fortune. I think we did a conversation and discussion with Jason Zinneman, and learning a little bit about the case. Like every episode we talk about a movie, and then I go in a deep dive, a rabbit hole of like, oh wow, this film has existed and has this whole discussion that's already been going on for many years, but kind of like learning about Alan Dershowitz and all the people he had represented up until that point and then have since represented, and then learning about the Klaus von Bülow case, and then just learning about Ron Silver and his body of work. I think that was kind of an interesting movie that I probably would not have otherwise watched. I think if I'm doing honorable mentions, I may go with something like Girlfriends. We discussed that with Jesse Conweiler. That was kind of an interesting movie as well. Not one that I had heard of before, I don't think. Maybe I've seen a poster in passing, but I don't think I would have, I would have watched that movie otherwise. So those are my picks. But congrats to all those that were nominated. And hopefully you get picked
Congrats
in later
for the
categories.
Winners. Yeah. And I really like those picks. Just wanted to say Girlfriends was probably my number 2 as well. So I'm happy that you gave it that shout out. And Reversal of Fortune is a great one also, just because I think it was one that had led to such a rich discussion that, if I can hype up our own past episodes, that I think that movie unlocked for us about, questions of, morality and your, liability in some of these cases and your responsibility. And, it's always great when a movie kind of unexpectedly, is brought up by a guest of the podcast. It's one of the best things about this podcast that our guests come up with movies that, I wouldn't intuitively think are Jewish or I wouldn't even have heard of. And, it's such a great vehicle for discovery. So really, really happy to give out those awards. I want to bring us to our second category, our second Oyster of the night.
Next up, the movie that was more Jewish than expected.
More Jewish than expected. Let's see. Looking at our list again, I'm going to have to go with Dough. I feel like Dough, we discussed that with Meir Zwanziger, and that was the film about the baker who unintentionally bakes cannabis into his challahs in a British community, a small town British community. I feel like they got a lot of things right. I was expecting it to be kind of a sort of one-hit wonder kind of thing, like the jokes really were only like one way, but it was a very touching film, and I think it got a lot about Judaism right in terms of some of the rituals and some of the discussion points and the dress and things like that. So yeah, that would probably be my pick. A lot of the other films were not Jewish on the surface, maybe like an honorable mention for like Kentucky Fried Movie for some of their Jewish mentions. But yeah, how about yourself, Harry? What was one that was kind of more Jewish than you expected it?
So I think I'm going to give this answer to the movie that we covered, X-Men First Class.
You love that one.
Yeah, I did love that one. And that was a movie that I really enjoyed beforehand. It stars a performance of one of my favorite actors ever in Michael Fassbender. But I remember when he picked that movie to discuss, I said, right, yeah, like it's kind of part of Magneto's background is that he has this, Holocaust survival. And I was like, sure, we'll pull some of that in. What was really surprised me upon rewatching it, and then obviously our discussion, was how much the movie's plot actually hinged on the Jewishness, how the Jewishness isn't just this kind of plug and play dark backstory to motivate this character, but ultimately his relationship with his past, this Eric character, defines a lot of the moral questions of the movie. It defines, one of the pivotal hinge points where he reflects on this memory of him as a child lighting his Hanukkah candles. So much of this movie is about finding, newfound family and how you connect to the past and bring it forward versus, let it weigh you back. And I was really surprised just how much the Jewishness I thought was pretty tastefully and effectively pulled into the rest of the movie. So I think that was definitely a movie that, was a 1-star coming in, and I don't want to misremember what I gave it, but I want to say somewhere in the 3-4 range because I really appreciated the Jewishness of that.
Yeah, that's a solid pick, and shout out to Jakob Friedman for guesting on that episode. Terrific podcast producer in his own right, and we were honored to have him. So now that brings us to our next Oyster category.
And now, the most coded Jewish, non-explicitly Jewish character.
Harry, does something come to mind for you when I think of that very eloquently worded category?
Oh, wow. Whoever scripted those is going to keep his job next year. But I did think about this. I was looking through the list, and this is where I want to give our bottoms shout out to the non-Jewish actress Rachel Sennett, who we've discussed it at length there, but is someone who almost without trying plays coded Jewish. And of course, the world at large was mostly introduced to her through her performance in Shiva Baby, where she did play a Jew. So that certainly informs some of the way that I think we subsequently watch her. But Bottoms is not a movie that is explicitly Jewish in any regards. I wouldn't even argue that it's intending to code this character as Jewish.
Right.
Sometimes this theme, this questions of coded Jewish comes up because there were filmmakers who were Jewish filmmakers or who wanted to infuse, a Jewishness into a role, but either the movie didn't ask for it or they didn't feel comfortable, in their screenwrite, in their screenplay, working in explicit Jewishness. And that's often where we'll see coded Jewishness. That might even be, where it comes from when you make your pick, Daniel. But this one is certainly not that, but it almost can't help itself. I think Rachel Sennett's humor just plays so Jewish to me and to many of us. And it just feels like a kind of neurotic, ridiculous, very funny Jewish role in a way that, I love the association with Jewishness. I love that, this kind of coded Jewish. I hope people read that and think that that's a great, fun interpretation of Jewishness. But it's certainly a little bit of a dicey pick in this section for someone who, wasn't pretending to be Jewish. I think that might just be the Jews on Film glasses I'm wearing, but I couldn't not give it to her. But what do you think, Daniel? What was your most coded Jewish, not explicitly Jewish role of the movies that we covered this year?
Well, you know me, I love Albert Brooks. So I'm going to give our inaugural Oyscar to Albert Brooks, the character played by Albert Brooks in the film Real Life. I think, very coded Jewish in that film. There's no like mezuzah or menorah lighting or any sort of oives in the movie itself. But I think Albert Brooks, the character, brings a lot, or rather I should say Albert Brooks, the actor, brings a lot to Albert Brooks, the character, in real life. So I think that would be my pick. There's a lot of good picks on here, but I think because the discovery of that movie and sort of, again, going through Albert Brooks's filmography and things like that was really a huge discovery for me and a huge unlock in the podcast. I'm going to have to pick that for myself. Yeah. So congratulations to all that. Yeah. To all the winners.
Congratulations. I like that one a lot. I think looking at our list, the Albert Brooks and I would say Billy Crystal in When Harry Met Sally, which I didn't pick, but those I think were staring in the face of this is, they could be the face of coded Jewishness.
The kings of coded
Jews. That's a really great pick. Yeah. The kings of coded Jews. We'll give them a special award.
Yeah, absolutely. Should we move on to our next category? What do you think?
Let's do it. Let's give out the next Oyscar.
I'm getting hungry, Harry.
Next, the best on-screen food.
So I am very happy that you let me go first. Obviously, Daniel, we always talk about, food being a symbol of Jewishness in these movies. I think sometimes movies might have iconic Jewish cuisine in them. I'm thinking of deli sandwiches. I won't say more in case that's one of that you want to pick. Sometimes movies have even just families coming together and celebrating big food, and that kind of evokes this Jewish idea, especially big Jewish families. I mentioned I'm happy I'm going first because I'm going to talk about the food movie that we covered on this podcast, and that, of course, is Big Night, which was a whole movie centered around food. It is so clearly the best food on screen. I think that movie represents exactly what I was just saying, a community coming together over food and celebrating fun and, really delicious, presumably food. We had an amazing guest on that episode. We discussed that with Leah Koenig, and we were talking about her Roman Jewish cookbook and, her love of Jewish food. And that made for a really fun and incredible discussion. And it actually worked on two levels because we were celebrating a movie where people come together over food while we were also having a conversation about some of our favorite foods, our Ashkenaz and Sephardic favorite foods, and, coming together over those. So that to me, and I guess I'll give the movie the win for that. I might give the risotto in that movie the specific pick for the best food, if that's what the question was asking.
Yeah.
But that movie was wonderful. What about you, Daniel? What was the best food on screen this year that we covered on the podcast?
Yeah, and if I just a shout out to that episode, if I do recall correctly, that was sort of the launch of our subsequent sister podcast, Jews on Food, where you had a lot of food related questions for Leah, and it was very exciting to sort of see you in your element, in your zone in that one, talking about all the food things. Yeah.
I forgot about that. I inundated her at the end. I was just thrown off. I'm like, just while you're here, can we talk about Jewish Roman cuisine? And
sure,
it was a great episode. It was great. I would recommend everyone listens 100%. Back. Yeah.
For all the foodies out there. I think for me, because you've kind of claimed that one, I'm going to zag where you zigged. I might pick Zohan. sort of that beginning scene where Zohan is playing hacky sack, butt naked on the beach, and he's frying like tilapia up. It just looks really, really good.
Yeah.
Like sort of freshly fried fish. And he like flips it on the table and just kind of like, and then he flicks hummus on everybody's plates. I think there's maybe some Israeli side salad on there. So sort of, and in general, I feel like there's a lot of good cuisine depicted in that film. You Don't Mess with the Zohan. And we did an episode with Jake Gillis, and that was a great, sort of a great showing for both, I believe, Palestinian cuisine and Israeli cuisine. So that's a twofer for me. And that's sort of my pick for the best on-screen food. So congrats to all the winners, and congrats to all those who were nominated.
So let's take it to the next category. And, often on this podcast, we'll talk about that kind of signature Jewish humor and, how we define that. And I think we very loosely define it because there's a lot of ways to talk about it. But let's give it another try and discuss
The Jewish Humor Award for Funniest Jewish Movie, Scene.
Yeah, that is a tough one. I think I might have to lock in and maybe pick one or two because there's a lot of solid comedies in this list of movies that we covered. I would say probably like Spinal Tap had a lot of really, really funny scenes. And Jewish scenes, I forget, are there specific Jewish scenes in the movie that I missed? I think overall, just like the sort of, like there's a lot of Jews that make up the cast and crew of that film. So I'm kind of honoring that, distinction and calling that a Jewish film. So I think, just the improv nature of it, it was really well done. I think honorary mentions to like Real Life as well and Zohan in some parts I think were really funny. Yeah, I think I'll go with those. But maybe with like a shining sort of, if I had to give one Oyster out, I think it would be for Spinal Tap. How about yourself?
I want to also celebrate some Jewish humor on screen. I'll go back to Real Life. I know you mentioned it just now in your additional ones, but I had the whole horse operation scene for those. You should check out the movie just to watch those scenes. I think they're so funny. There's one joke that I have written down. I was going back in my notes from there when, of course, they're doing. This character is like a veterinarian. He's an animal surgeon, and he's doing surgery on a horse. And ultimately, they kind of mess it up and kill the horse very quickly. So there's one line that Albert Brooks just delivers in voiceover, very kind of straightforward, where he says, "The procedure was over at 2:45, well ahead of schedule," which I really lost it. That I lost it when I heard that the first time. But then, I want to just give a bonus shout out to a couple lines later, because this one felt maybe more explicitly Jewish. We've spoken about Jewish humor is often roiled up in immigrant humor and language discrepancies and not understanding each other. So, the doctor ultimately comes out and says, "We lost her," referring to the horse, that it died. And the person whose horse it was says, "How is that possible? Don't you have people watching her?" Just kind of assuming that the horse got lost. And I loved it. That was such like quick, sharp Jewish humor. I think that if I needed to show, make a clip just to show you, what Jewish humor could look like, it'd be those two scenes. So shout out to Albert Brooks in Real Life.
Yeah, very, very Marx Brothers kind of like verbal humor or like wordplay. I think really, really well done. So congrats to the winners in that category. Let's move on to our big three, sort of what everyone's been waiting for. It's that time in the night where, should we do an in memoriam section here?
I don't think we have anything.
I don't have any in memoriam, so let's just move on to our big three. But we're going to flip things up a little bit because it is the Oyscars. It is that special night where all of Hollywood comes out to shine. They just lost their invite, so it's me and Harry tonight representing.
Next up, the best movie for the Jews.
You mean like the best movie that's good or bad for the Jews? Is that what you're saying?
The way we always ask, is this good for the Jews? We're going to ask what movie actually is the best for the Jews. Daniel, do you want to get us started picking a movie there?
Yeah. I think, let's see. A coded best movie for the Jews, I think, is probably something like Harry Met Sally, or maybe Marathon Man even. I feel like, Marathon Man is our sort of like wimpy Jew who becomes like a tough Jew with the help of his brother, Rory Scheider. Dustin Hoffman, who's this sort of like bookish Jew, kind of transforms a little bit and sort of is able to defeat the Nazis, which is always a good thing. So I think either Marathon Man or Harry Met Sally, which kind of like cemented Billy Crystal's place as a coded Jew in the late 80s, early 90s, and really like the Nora Ephron of it all, and sort of the Carrie Fisher-ness. I think really that movie is pretty good for the Jews, and then New York has like a pretty solid showing there as well. So that those will be my picks. Harry, how about yourself?
I had one come to mind and then realized that we recorded it, but I don't think I've published it yet because I don't see it on the list here. So I am not going to go with that one, but that's a teaser for a movie coming up on your feeds that, believe me when I say was very, very good for the Jews, or at least the case was made pretty convincingly. But just looking at this list, I think a couple ones that I think I'm gonna have to choose similar to you, ones that kind of like maybe aren't espousing kind of Jewish, the beauty of Jewish life so much on screen. I'm not sure how many of those we really covered here, but ones that just, marked the arrival of important Jewish characters and brought in Jewish ideas and history and into, the lives of the cinema. So for that reason, I'm actually going to go with Raiders of the Lost Ark, the Steven
Okay.
Spielberg movie that great for the Jews. And it's kind of, like I mentioned, an announcement, pronouncement almost of Steven Spielberg on the scene as this incredible Jewish filmmaker. I mentioned this at the time. It was the first time I had watched the movie in full, and it was as tight and compelling as a movie that I've seen. It really, is so good and so convincing, but also shows characters that are engaging with religious Jewish past, understanding the Ark of the Covenant and dealing with the overwhelming effects of that, and ultimately leaving the movie, I think, with a bit of a reverence for, this deep Jewish past. So, certainly the way I watch the movie, and maybe hopefully some other members of the audience, watch it too. But that movie played very, very good for the Jews to me. So that's going to be my pick.
You'll have to excuse me, Harry. I'm going to go off the teleprompter for just a moment and say that I absolutely love moments in the podcast where you, you say that you've like watched the film for the first time and we are getting to like unpack it on the pod. That is like so exciting to sort of feel, to witness you like watching these movies for the first time and then getting to kind of unpack them with the guests. And then similar to me, like whenever I'm watching a film that a guest suggests and it's like it's a new experience for us, being able to kind of witness that and see kind of things blossom in real time is kind of nice. So let me go back to the script after that. But yeah.
No, I love that's why our first category, the most exciting movie that was shown to us by, that we wouldn't have watched otherwise. Sure. Like it's the best part of the podcast is really getting introduced to all these amazing movies, having, hopefully interesting for our listeners, but definitely enjoyable conversations, from our ends. And I am grateful that we got to do it in 2024. I'm looking forward to the next slate. And that's why we're here today, celebrating a great year of Jews on Film with our first annual Oyscars.
And for our next category, the penultimate category of our Oyscars ceremony this year.
Now, the favorite stretch of the year.
And a reminder for those who are now, for some reason, just tuning in to our Oyscars special and not to any of our previous episodes. The stretch is something that we are reading into it with our Jews on Film glasses, that the filmmaker had not intended to be a Jewish reference, deep cut, biblical allusion, anything like that, but we are reading into it. Harry, what is your favorite stretch of the year?
Trying to remember, some of the ones from back then. I could have done more homework maybe and listened back to our whole catalog, but I'll trust the viewers to do that, or the listeners to do that. But just looking back at some of the ones that I had the most fun with. So, best stretch, you could interpret it as what's the one that was most convincing, sure. But I just decided to think about it like, what are the ones that could have maybe weren't intended, but you had the most fun with, have it, just thrown out there and coming up with your kind of clever tie-in. So I actually immediately thought of the Persepolis one when we discussed that film. For those who don't recall, I'm not going to do the work right now to build up the entire context of the movie, but definitely check out the podcast. But I remember giving a stretch there that was about the perfumed flowers that were used by, the matriarchal grandmother figure in that movie, and the way that she kind of perfumed, used those so that she would smell good, all the time. And the movie Persepolis closes with this kind of showering of those flowers. And I remember connecting it at the time to, the Havdalah and the way that we kind of use these scents when performing the Havdalah ceremony. So that we do every week at the end of the Shabbos as a way to kind of, despite losing kind of the comfort of Shabbos, we use those good smells that, of the Besamim that we do at Havdalah to kind of restore some of that, good feeling and take that with us to the week, even as we're leaving. And
Right.
I think the way that it mapped onto the movie, where these characters, this was a character who was leaving her home country, but kind of was showering herself with the familiar smells, to me evoked a really Jewish idea in a movie that, admittedly, if I remember, wasn't very Jewish in its text. I think there was a Jewish character here or there, but the people we were following weren't Jewish. And that just felt like something in our Jewish world that either was being adopted in the same way or just infused deeper meaning into, what was just a pretty poetic scene at the end of the movie. So that probably was my favorite stretch of the year. Daniel, do you have any good stretches that you remember that you want to replay for our audience in case they missed, your really good take in one of our episodes?
That's a really good question. And I should have seen it coming because I just asked you that question.
Sure.
But I think I feel like there was some pretty good stretches tossed out in the Hudson Hawk episode with Adam Mansbach, where we mapped Hudson's Jewishness, throughout the film. We kind of mapped that onto him. I don't remember exactly what the stretches were. I remember there was just some good kind of like Adam got the assignment and really like went with it. So kudos to him for for really rolling out the red carpet and pulling out all those stretches. I feel like Real Life also had some really good ones. Shout out to Eddie Schmidt for helping us out with that episode. I think something with the cameras, like the omnipresence of them all, was sort of like godlike in some way. And then maybe something with the Raiders episode where there was readings of the Kadams on the staff, and it was like there was like
it was about like the height measurements and like the tefach.
Yeah.
I remember those.
Yeah. So really, like, clearly, I probably should have prepped for this a little bit better, but I think those 3 episodes to me stuck out as ones that had like particularly good stretches. But I'd encourage everyone to check all of them out because just like my children, I love them all equally, and it's hard to pick a favorite. So,
Daniel, that reminds me of some episodes when we ask you to pick a score and you say, 3 to 4-ish or something, or 3.5, 4, like 4.5.
Right.
Like,
Right.
you can't choose one. And I love it. I love you giving a shout out to all of some of the great stretches. Hopefully this encourages people to go back and listen to some of those episodes you mentioned. And before we go on to the very final category that we're going to give out tonight, the big Oyscar, kind of our best picture on this podcast, you've done a good job tonight of mentioning some of the names of the people that have been guests on the podcast in association with the movies that they covered. But
sure.
I wanted to just give a special thank you to everyone who came onto the podcast. And maybe if you want to just kind of read out the names real quick of just some of the people and the movies that they covered that were on the podcast now.
So I think, inverting the sort of in memoriam tradition where you like read all the names of the people who are dead this past year. Why don't we just like do the opposite of that and like a huge thank you to everyone who guested on the podcast in the year 2024.
That are all alive and well.
Adam Mansbach, Tamim Fruchter, Yoshi Fruchter, Jason Zinnemann, Leah Koenig, Meir Zwanziger, Noah Gittell, Becky Feldman, David Tuckman, Ray Schiller, Adam Lisa Gore, Danielle Dardashti, Yaakov Friedman, Eddie Schmidt, Jesse Conweiler, Ilana Kaplan, Shoval Chuva, Sam Lipsight, Jake Gillis. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Daniel, for running through those names. And thank you to all of you for guesting on the podcast. This is a treat that we get to have someone for almost every episode. And it's great meeting you all and discussing your movies.
We're looking forward in the year 2025 to talking to even more exciting, even more guests, artists, filmmakers, comedians, writers, graphic novelists, and friends of the pod, as it were. So continue to keep in touch with us and stay subscribed. But now, for the moment we've all been waiting for.
Let's do it. So this is this is our equivalent of the Best Picture Oyscar, and this is our favorite question to ask on this podcast. But really, for the end of year.
Finally, the most Jewish movie of the year.
Daniel, why don't you get us started?
No pressure, huh? Let's see.
All the pressure. Yeah, I'm sure if you went back to our episodes, you could actually see what we gave the highest scores to.
Right.
I don't remember. I apologize if I choose something that had a lower score than something else here, but this is our reflection. This is thinking back.
Yeah.
What was the most Jewish movie?
Not to tease our hand or to play our hand too much, but I think 2025 had a lot of strongly Jewish films. Some of them we were mentioned up top, but we'll save that for next year's Oyscars. I think for this year, something that was like explicitly Jewish or the most Jewish, taking into account all of our metrics that we discussed during the podcast, and then kind of having time as well to think about it, I might have to go with like Marathon Man. Dustin Hoffman, and Laurence Olivier as a Nazi, and just the sort of 1970s era New York. There's just a lot of languages in the movie. Whenever you have Nazis in the film, it's a surefire way to like get a few points on our radar in terms of the Jewishness scale, unfortunately. But that would be my pick, I think, Marathon Man with Sam Lipsyte. Harry, what about yourself?
We didn't plan this, but maybe it actually is appropriate that the big one should be kind of collectively decided by us. But I actually was also thinking Marathon Man.
No way.
I think Marathon Man, I really do. Like, I'm looking through some of the lists. We mentioned, Doe and Made for Each Other, some that have more explicit Jewishness. But this was a wonderful movie that was this big mainstream movie that so much played on the Jewishness, and the plot of it hinged on the Jewish kind of stolen jewelry and stolen diamonds, from Holocaust survivors. It was so much about characters interrogating their past and, the generational trauma of it all. I mean, I'm just throwing out the buzzwords now because that's,
go for it.
So much of what we kind of spot in these Jewish movies. But, I think there's a case that could be made for a lot of them. But this was a movie that like, it kind of meets all of the other categories before. Maybe that's what makes it the most Jewish movie. It was unexpectedly Jewish. It had Jewish coded characters, and it was played with Judaism as its like subtext. Like, this was a movie that brought a lot of Jewishness. So I like it as our pick, Marathon Man. Thank you. Special shout out to Sam Lipsyte for choosing and discussing that movie with us. But you guys win for the most Jewish movie, Oyscar.
Congratulations.
And if you're watching on camera, Daniel's got the Oyscar in hand.
There you go.
Congratulations.
Yeah, directed by John Schlesinger, written by William Goldman. There's so much. And we really just want to thank all the nominees and all the guests from the past year for joining us on our Oyscar ceremony. And be sure, to check out all the episodes we mentioned. Be sure to stay subscribed to our podcast. We have a lot of good episodes coming up. A lot of special interviews coming out in the next coming year. And thank you again. And also, I wanted to just give a special Oyscar to best co-host. Harry, this is for you. I'm going to give you a special Oyscar for being the best co-host out there. Even though you're not on the best coast, you are the best co-host. Shout out to you.
Thank you. I see what you did there. And what's that? This just in, they just retallied the votes, and it was actually a tie for best co-host. And Daniel, I think you've got it too. I think we're going to have to cut this Oyscar in half and share it. But congratulations to you. This was a great year doing the podcast together. I am excited for the ones we've already published in 2025, the ones that are, to be recorded, to be published. And like you said, I hope our guests can continue listening in, checking out the sweatshirts, really support the podcast. It's such a joy doing it with you. And I'm happy to celebrate a really great year of movies and of Jews on Film.
Yeah, exactly. 100%. Usually, I am wearing like the Jews on Film swag during our Oyscars or during our podcast recording. But today, as you can see, I'm kind of dressed up, for the formal occasion. You as well. Dressed up to the nines.
My black and white.
Yeah, the black and white. Yeah. Black tie optional or black sweatshirt optional. But thank you again, everyone, for tuning in. And really appreciate it. And thanks for listening.
Thank you for tuning in to the first annual Jews on Film Oyscars. Please make sure to subscribe to the podcast and leave a review if you can. It makes a huge difference in helping other people find our show.